So, thank you, Cosmin, for the introduction, and thank you, Parasite, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here to respond to this conference's anxiety about art's ability to prevail in the current political climate. I begin with a provocative and hopefully political image. In 2016, the Philippine President, Rodrigo Duterte, speaking before the press, flashed images of the Budadjo incident in the island of Jolo in Mindanao in 1906. Refusing to submit to American dominion, around 1,000 Muslim men, women, and children were slaughtered by the merciless artillery of the imperial forces 7 years after the United States of America had claimed the Philippines as its colony. The Budadjo massacre testifies to the harrowing methods of American pacification in the Philippines. 110 years later, Duterte reminds Barack Obama in equally graphic language that the United States has never apologized for this bloodbath, and cautioned him to reconsider his stance when he speaks of the killings brought about by the president's obsessive war on drugs. Curiously, the figurative language surrounding, on the one hand, the often obscured Philippine-American War, and on the other, the war on drugs, can be traced to the American political lexicon, as it oscillates between the manifest destiny of William McKinley and the rehabilitation of Richard Nixon. Duterte would follow through his tirade against the United States in his State of the Nation address in 2017, in which he would revive interest in the repatriation of the bells of Balangiga, a town on the island of Samar in the Visayas. In 1901, an American general ordered his soldiers to kill, burn, and turn the place into a howling wilderness. The bells are currently kept by the Americans as war trophies. It is important to mark out two details here: that the references of Duterte against global imperialism come not from the capital, that is Manila, but from peripheries like Jolo and Samar, with Duterte's own provincial persona as a former mayor of the southern city of Davao coordinating the assemblage, and that the indices to historical trauma come by way of photographs and bells, technologies of both presence and haunting. I am reminded here of Salud Algabre, a woman revolutionary who took part in a peasant rebellion against the Americans in the 1930s. Algabre remembers how in her Catholic town there was a church bell. During summer, in her recollection, when the water was clear, you could see down through the depths, down to where it stood. The reason they disposed of it was because mothers, early in their pregnancy, would give birth prematurely upon hearing it toll. In Algabre's memory, the bells of religion disrupted childbirth, and in fact aborted possible progeny. But the uprising that they had incited created conditions of successive struggles in the right direction, according to her. The image and sound of death in the imaginations of Algabre and Duterte, and most probably of the people of Balangiga, formed the sensorium of terror from the successive colonial periods under Spain and America of nearly 5 centuries to the present. And Duterte's anti-American performance makes sense historically, as it subtends the political programs of colonialism and capitalism. William Garriott has noted that the problem of narco-politics was a defining element of American statecraft in the 20th century, permitting the latter to coordinate everything from the regulation of schools and neighborhoods to the reshaping of military intervention and foreign policy to the reinterpretation of the Constitution and other fundamental sources of legal rights. This may well be the architecture of what James Petras and Henry Weltmeyer call narco-capitalism, or the capitalism of the 21st century, that America consolidates as its government arms the drug wars of other countries, and its banks receive, launder, and transfer hundreds of billions of dollars to drug lords' accounts to buy modern arms, pay private armies of assassins, and corrupt political and law enforcement officials. The Philippine historian Reynaldo Ileto, in his recent book, Knowledge and Pacification, marks the gesture of Duterte, presenting the images of American atrocities as significant. For Ileto, a turning point might have been reached in the life of this century-old discourse when a mayor-president is able to lecture his audiences on the forgotten and yet catastrophic war against the United States. In speculating in this manner, Ileto bravely moves away from certain axioms in Philippine historiography on state formation in the Philippines. Much of the orthodoxy comes from the nearly venerated Benedict Anderson, who tends to reduce Philippine political life in the 20th century to the manipulations of the cacique, or the local political class, which inevitably generated an almost all-powerful national oligarchy. Ileto finds this misplaced, stemming from the rigid binarisms of, according to him, mind, body, reason, passion, public, private, that underlie political rationality, images of the body politic, and the very idea of the political itself. It is in this context that I begin my initial reflections on the political nature of the image of the dead held by a president, who is alleged as the exemplary cacique, cast as a rural despot turned illiberal president in current time. In order to better grasp the complex relationships between social agents in a Philippine 19th century town, the embryo from which the instincts of President Duterte had been supposedly nurtured, Reynaldo Ileto in another essay sketches out what he calls the three relatively autonomous realms in the rural life in the time of revolution in the Philippines. The first realm is the Catholic space of the church-convent complex, the friar and his civilizing mission, and the town around it. The second realm is the political space of local administrators, the mayor, his allies, tenants, police, and kinfolk. And the third is a holy mountain called Mount Banahaw in the island of Luzon. According to Ileto, the holy mountain was recognized as a source of supernatural powers. At certain times of the year, such as Holy Week, such potency was accessible to those who made the pilgrimage to the mountain. The mountain had its spiritual leaders whose power yielded talismans, healed the sick, and allowed the people to converse with their dead relations. In assessing the Catholic image as a political moment, it might be productive to probe the third realm. Much has been said about the idiocy and isolatedness of rural life, but it was also through this rural life that a lasting revolution traversing the realms of the church and the state was made possible. It is interesting, therefore, to reflect on the tension between the theory of the image of the Catholic doctrine and the place of Duterte's political origin, that is Mindanao, the Islamic south of the Philippines that tenaciously held its ground against both Spanish and American colonization and imperialism. This was Duterte's rural life and revolution too. In the 50s, in another town in Negros called Victorias, the Osorio family, the Osorio family built a chapel for the community of workers and personnel. The Church of St. Joseph the Worker in Negros was part of a reconstruction project of Victoria's Milling, which is considered the largest integrated sugar mill in the country at present. The Osorio family owned the mill and commissioned the architectural firm Raymond and Rado, based in New York and Tokyo, to design a church for the community of around 3,000 in 1947, as part of the scheme to consolidate refineries in one area in the aftermath of the Pacific War. Both from the former Czechoslovakia, Raymond worked with Frank Lloyd Wright in Tokyo, and Rado was a peer of Walter Gropius. The most prominent detail of the sanctuary is the painting of Alfonso Osorio, popularly known as the Angry Christ. It swarms the altar, the ceiling, and the beams. According to Osorio, who was an early collector of Pollock and Dubuffet, this is Osorio, and a queer painter that the American abstract expressionist canon cannot seem to recognize, The subject was worked out in terms of the main action that takes place in the sanctuary, which is the sacrifice of the Mass. I had a large seated figure of Christ with hands open, supported by the hands of God the Father that came out of the blue. It is the Last Judgment. It's a continual Last Judgment with the sacrifice of the Mass that is the continual reincarnation of God coming into this world. One of the architects, Antonin Raymond, thought that this ornamentation was unfortunate, having obscured the natural concrete work and the entire architectural expression. Raymond, who had designed American military bases in the region, stated in his autobiography that the sugar tycoons had told him that one way to prevent the spread of communism on the island of Negros would be to imbue the people with an ardent religious spirit by reviving their interest in Catholicism, the reason the church had to be built. This was confirmed by the landlord Federico Osorio, who spoke of the church as a deep Christian commitment to the Christian faith and as a means of buttressing Philippine democracy against an emerging communist insurgency. The Catholic image surely has been subjected to a range of critical plastic reconsiderations by Philippine artists, as may be seen in a work by Hernando Ocampo, who juxtaposes the crucified Christ against the smokestacks of factories. Nino Lucio Alvarado, who comes from the same island on which the church where the painting of Osorio stands, has appropriated certain aspects of Catholic iconography to speak to the deep and sharp cleavages of class in the plantations of Negros. In doing so, Alvarado is able to extend the horizon of significations of the image and to politicize or even radicalize it. Also, the artist creates the crucial nexus between colonial history and contemporary social structure that is largely mediated by religious culture. Finally, Alvarado cites the expressionist aesthetic of Osorio to render urgency, horror, and even anger. It must be noted, however, that Philippine art history has seen more aggressive revisions of the Catholic image. Manuel Ocampo, for instance, rethinks the technology of painting and image itself, and alongside it, the implications of colonial modernity and its global context. In this effort, the scatological or the pornographic and the eschatological or the apocalyptic tend to touch their nerve endings and frazzle the painting that mingles wantonly the night of the Ku Klux Klan, the Catholic penitent, and the Philippine revolutionary. In many instances, the religious form is altogether disfigured. Such disfiguration cannot seem to be assimilated within the liberal democratic polity of the post-colonial Philippine nation-state. In 2011, the artist Medeo Cruz, in an exhibition commemorating the centennial of a Catholic university, did an installation, not centennial, an anniversary, of a Catholic university, did an installation called Polytheismo or Polytheism, of a makeshift shrine of promiscuous images at the cultural center of the Philippines. Among them is a face of Christ, onto which the male genital from a kitschy souvenir ashtray is grafted. This incited a furor in the Philippine social world, prompting former First Lady Imelda Marcos, who built the center. And it's curious that she's wearing a dress with a peacock design while viewing the work, and herself to view the work. The previous president, Benigno Aquino III, to order the closure of the exhibition. And priests to say after Mass the prayer of reparation for the sin of sacrilege and blasphemy. An oratio imperata, Latin for obligatory prayer that is reserved for times of calamity. With these fragments of images as atmosphere, the paper praises articulations of critique that appropriate the Catholic image as a trajectory into a broader critique of social structure. It tries to discuss the ways by which artistic practice has mediated colonial iconography to respond to the implications of political theology. In doing so, it sketches out a long arc of visual production to investigate the possibilities of the political in what is commonly referred to as the only Catholic nation in Asia. This arc of the argument extends to the current milieu of executions in the Philippines amid the intense challenge to the ideological mystifications of an earlier oligarchy that exploited the religious sign system of martyrdom to supposedly oppose autocracy and corruption. One trajectory that I explore in my work as an art historian of the Philippine image is the relationship between religion and the modernity of nation. In this regard, Talal Asad's discussion of the ecology of religion, the nation state, and secularism is helpful. According to Asad, religious ideas can be secularized. Nationalism has, in part or whole, a religious origin, and that the true concept of the secular cannot do without the idea of religion. In light of this assertion, Asad calls for the anthropology of the secular that might intersect with what I would term the art history of political theology. Surely this incipient thinking is largely shaped by the ideas of Carl Schmitt, who has asserted that, and I quote, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from the theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because their systematic structure. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. In the context of the present political climate in the Philippines, it might be instructive to revisit political theology as an entry point into a discussion of the Catholic image that is honed in the crucible of contestation of both class and the spiritual, as broadly conceived in both Christian and animist registers. A key trope in this analysis and meditation might be execution, that sheds light on a possible future of the world. In the first history painting in Southeast Asia, the painter Esteban Villanueva tells the tale of an insurrection provoked by the Spanish government's regulation of the local sugarcane wine called the basi, so that the colonizers could sustain the coffers of the colony. The root of the uprising was therefore spirit, that was so central in ritual and everyday life in the locality. And the visual annotation is interestingly akin to the Via Crucis, or Stations of the Cross, which narrates Christ's Passion, having been organized around 14 panels that end with the hanging and the beheading of the rebels. A vital detail in the painting is the comet that streaks across the sky and recurs in the panels. As it reappears, it also mutates, transforming from a celestial body of fire and ice to what may well be a palm frond that either consummates or commemorates the quelling of the unrest. Here, the elements of air and land, the life of the atmosphere and of the earth, condense to illuminate a historical event. The comet that emits light and transfigures as a palm registers the nature of art history, one that is melancholic and premonitory, fixated on dissipating objects of wonder and on the expectant subjectivity of a people who are open to miracles, or at least to conversions, from sugarcane to wine, or from star to flora. At the turn of the century, another image of execution surfaces in Juan Luna's Spoliarium, which was conferred a prize at the Madrid Exposition in 1884, and was read by the future national hero Jose Rizal as an allegory of colonial abjection, and the transcendence of it by the native genius, the painter, who in his words, and I quote him, knows no country, like light, air, the patrimony of everybody, cosmopolitan like space, like life, like God. The contemporary artist, Archie Oclos, elaborates on the problematic of execution in a series of initiations in site-specific political action. And I turn to the work of Oclos because he takes us back to the feudal plantation as the locus of intense class conflict. On Good Friday in 2017, he went to Hacienda Luisita in Tarlac, an obscenely sprawling sugar plantation owned by the family of Corazon Aquino, Ferdinand Marcos's successor, who postured as the antithesis of the much vilified dictator. In one corner of the vastness of the hacienda, he planted a wooden image of a tortured and abducted peasant as a crucified Christ and called it the Lord Without Land, in obvious reference to the word landlord, and to remind the public of the massacre that took place in the estate in 2004 and the struggle for genuine land reform as we speak. Archie Ocklus's performative act of embedding the cross in blitzkrieg mode in the plantation takes us to a new terrain of image production, one that is both timely and untimely, site-specific and out of place, animate and inanimate. If we put a theological layer over this political image, we imbibe the sense of the nature of the killing of both Christ and peasant, distributed across the sensibilities of the Lord, the landlord, and the Lord without land. Ocklos does murals all over Manila in found empty spaces, and he paints them in the daytime so as not to invite the interest of authorities. One of these murals is Rice Not Bullets, done to sustain the historical reference to the Kidapawan massacre, in which peasants were killed in 2016 in the south of the country. The mural conveys a metonym of what is termed as casualty, and in the imagination of the artist, it may well translate the sacrificial into the collateral, or the unintended consequence of a war, in the universal ecology of impunity. Ocklos would confine that viewers of the mural thought that he was portraying the dead people of the drug war of the Duterte government, as depicted by fragments of isolated, foreshortened, and bloodied feet. The misrecognition of the casualty is, I think, salient in this instance, and the relationality between two phenomena of killing is remarkable. This multiple coding of the Catholic image, both iconographic in the case of the crucified Christ and the metonymic in the case of the fallen peasants, is a productive confusion that invites relación, which in Spanish is both narrative and relationship. Affinity and fiction, the historical and the collective interpenetrate to ensure critical intimacy, or what Alexander Baumgarten calls extensive clarity. Data on Duterte's war on drugs are discrepant, from a high of 13,000 deaths within a year to a low of 4,000 according to the government. Some claim that the violence is perpetrated by the state through the police, and that Duterte's incendiary rhetoric has fired up the instinct to kill. The government has denied the existence of such policy to kill, and has reasoned that the figure of fatalities comes from a mix of legitimate operations, syndicate killings, and police abuse that are all linked to the corruption in the military, organized crime, and the global narcotic trade. The Philippine government believes that the drug problem is pervasive, although this is disputed by certain statistics. State agencies report of seized methamphetamine worth $230 million American dollars after a year of the campaign. Duterte believes that the Philippines has become a narco state. I will not dwell on the soundness of the claim of the narco state. I am interested, however, in how the Philippine post-Marcos state has been substantially weakened by interventions from what Reynaldo Ileto calls the second and third realms of rural life in a time of revolution. The local government engaged in the drug trade and the anti-communist religious cult. What strikes me is how these two realms condense in representations through the Catholic image as it circulates worldwide. On the one hand, there is the image of the dead, of the dead son in the hands of his mother in the well-known front page photograph of the New York Times, effectively referencing the Pieta of religious iconography to refute Duterte's human rights commitments. On the other hand, there are examples of film work from the 1980s to the present that reminds us of the long history of vigilantism and local militias and the refunctioning of the Catholic image as expressions of popular faith and grassroots democracy. It must be recalled that Lino Broca's film Ora Pro Nobis opens with a scene of an Italian priest in Mindanao being executed by the cult called Ora Pro Nobis. The title is at once the Latin phrase "pray for us" and the brain-eating cult. It ends with the main character, a former cadre of the underground movement, making contact with revolutionaries again after his son is killed by the cult leader. According to a report, around 200 vigilante organizations operated on Corazon Aquino's watch, and the vigilantes were supported by the government of Aquino and the church through its prominent Cardinal Sin. Yeah, we have a cardinal named Sin. As the main mythologists of the people power enterprise that deposed Marcos in 1986, Aquino and Sin, through the thought that vigilantism was an extension of a post-Marcos democratic ethos and a valid counterinsurgency strategy of low-intensity conflict in the countryside. Broca's efforts on vigilantism relate cogently with the work of the filmmaker Brilliante Mendoza of the succeeding generation. A decade later, in 2009, Mendoza did Kinatay, or literally Slaughter, for which he was awarded the Best Director prize at the Cannes Film Festival. In the film, the hired killer, who is a police rookie, takes part in the execution of a sex worker who is hacked to death. In his forthcoming film, Right to Kill, to be shown next year, Mendoza films in the shadow of Duterte's war on drugs, in which he fleshes out the tales of three men from the same family: a police officer, his brother-in-law, who is a gang leader, and the latter's nephew. The characters are entangled in a drug and filial network, and Mendoza tries to carve out the ethical basis of killing from the perspective of the institution, of the collective in the form of a gang, and of an individual who kills out of passion. The film ends with a young man hitting his girlfriend with a religious figurine of the child Christ, a savior of the world, which incidentally was the first Catholic image in the colony. With the pervasiveness of death as its dark universe, the film seems to ask what is needed to disabuse its banality, its so-called nature. The response comes with a shudder as it concludes with both murder and a lightning that strikes and splits a tree. Like the comet that attends a rebellion in colonial Philippines in the 19th century, the violent light from the cosmos bears the fundamental agency of world-making. Such a sign or portent prompts us to be critically political, to interrupt the historical process with what Hannah Arendt regards as the human initiative, and what Theodor Adorno animates as a sense of solidarity with what Brecht called tormentable bodies. If we conciliate Kinatay and Right to Kill, we might be able to grapple with the relationship between the execution that is mediated by Catholic image and what the Philippine Supreme Court defines as extrajudicial killings. The encounter between the two terms and how the aesthetic politically performs the execution are important to understand. What this paper contributes to our conversation on the political investments of the art in our time is the revisit to the image, contemplated here as Catholic and most possibly Baroque, in the sense that it is errant in the form, in form, in the words of the Cuban thinker Jose Lezama Lima. The intricacy of this inclusivity, this Catholic Baroqueness, opens up the image to critique and refiguration. Here, W.J.T. Mitchell might enlighten. He proposes a critical idolatry or secular divination as an antidote to what reflexive critical iconoclasm, and involves an approach to images that does not dream of destroying them and that recognizes every act of disfiguration or defacement as itself an act of creative destruction for which we must take responsibility. Mitchell teases out the ethical in aesthetic production and reception, in our responsiveness and responsibility. The ethical intuition is embodied, materialized, leading him to craft the word biopicture, in which the spectral nature of the image gains new technical prowess, some kind of a vital, animating, reincarnating energy. A moment of this biopicture is the clone, demonstrated by how the hooded figure of the Abu Ghraib prisoner who is tortured traces systems behind the systems that brought the torturers into this world. Mitchell implicates the Imago Dei, or image of God, in Christian iconography, and Hans Hake's Stargazer in his discussion of the torture, the torturers in the vicinity, and the idealized blindness to the evil of torture. By way of Mitchell, I return to Medeo Cruz, the artist of the provocative work Politeísmo, who came up this year with a postcard series on President Rodrigo Duterte as the gun-wielding Christ. He is king with crown and gun. If seen in relation to the Christ of Alfonso Osorio, Duterte may morph into a patrimonial politician from the periphery in the Philippines who has assumed supreme power in the Philippine nation-state. Beside another postcard portraying Corazon Aquino as the anti-Marcos heroine presiding over the massacre of peasants near her palace in 1987, the Catholic image conveys a reflexive cognitive mapping of the political that surmounts inter-elite partisan iterations. In the face of these images, church and state conflate in the Catholic image. But does that conflation flatten or stir up political responsiveness and responsibility? I think that political theology might be more acutely addressed through the metonymic potential of the image that dilates its ecology and heightens the elusive particular, and not through the violence against the Catholic image that tends to capture the political through iconoclasm and counter-iconography. In this regard, what is needed perhaps is the political shift from the sacrificial or the selfless and heroic to the collateral, the incidental, the partial, the metonymic, or that which can be recovered and not merely represented as victim or casualty. This recovered body ultimately discloses what Mitchell describes as systems behind systems that bring torturers into this world and raises into high relief the term casualty. With the notion of the collateral clarifying its nature, the casualty initially is seen as non-identical with the object of violence because it is unintended or, in fact, an error, as in the phrase collateral damage or collateral mortality. In the end, however, the subject that dies, the collateral casualty, is reinscribed in the object of general, common, and widespread death. It is the collateral, therefore, that politically forces us to think about what it means to be human. That is, to be, as the root of the word collateral indicates, alongside and together with the multitude of the dead, the very particular, very public, and very potent dead. Thank you.